Dan, you got no audio.
All right, we are live once again. There we go with Lloyd Melnick. And what are we talking about today? Understanding LTV, the most important KPI in gaming.
So welcome, Lloyd. I'm going to do a quick intro and then I'm going to get out of your way. But Lloyd is quite most likely my oldest friend in the industry, who I learned everything from. He drug a English literature student out of college, and I'm still here 23 years later. Lloyd's going to talk about data and LTV and all the wonderful things you need to know about it. And yeah, with that, man, it's off to you.
Thanks, Dan. Thanks, Jay. Appreciate it. Glad everyone who's been able to make it is here today. Really looking forward to this presentation. Hopefully you'll get a lot out of it. As Dan mentioned, we're talking about lifetime value, which probably gets referred to for the rest of the day as LTV. The presentation is on understanding LTV and why it's the most important KPI in gaming. So I've split the presentation into 3 segments today. First, why listen to it? Why is this important to you? Then, hopefully, if I've convinced you of that and you haven't churned by that time, how do you actually determine lifetime value? How do you calculate it? How do you look at it? And then what's probably the most important segment of the day, and why I'm putting it at the end so that I don't lose too many viewers, is how do you actually improve your lifetime value? How do you, if it's the most important KPI, how do you make it stronger? So let's first start with the why. Why are you here today? Why are you giving me an hour of your very precious day in life? Quite frankly, it's because lifetime value, LTV, is at the heart of survival of your game and potentially of your company. What lifetime value is the present value of a customer. So how much that new player or existing player or group of players, which we'll refer to as a cohort of players, is worth to you in the future. So if you're a restaurant and someone comes in 5 times, spends $10 each time, their lifetime value to that restaurant is $50. It's the same with gaming. How much is that person going to be worth looking forward for the amount, and you can set the time period, 6 months, 1 year, whatever, how much they're going to be worth to you. So why is that the key to survival? Because when you look at lifetime value and when you're evaluating your product and evaluating and growing your game, you're deciding whether or not to advertise. And the inverse of lifetime value is your cost to acquire a new player. And that's referred to as your cost per install in the mobile world, CPI. Quite frankly, at its core, if your lifetime value is less than your CPI, you can't advertise. To use an example, let's say it costs you $1 to acquire a player. That means you have a $1 CPI. Your lifetime value, that player is going to be worth 95 cents to you over their lifetime to you. It's not very difficult math to calculate that you don't want to spend $1 to get 95 cents. If you wanted to do that, you could spend all your time in Las Vegas. It's not a good business decision. It's not a way you can justify actually acquiring players. And in the game industry, especially the game industry now, you have to advertise to acquire players. Organics are going to be a very small part. Organics is what we refer to as the players that you are able to acquire, not through advertising, who just find your product, but that's going to be a really small part of it. So you have to advertise to acquire players. Even if you're if you've been able to maybe get a jump start, get a decent amount of players, you're going to lose players over time. At a minimum, people are going to pass away. They're going to stop gaming, whatever. But even the best of games, the Clash of Clans or whatever, they lose players over time. So you constantly have to be able to advertise to bring in new players. If your lifetime value, again, its cost is lower than the cost of acquiring that new player, you can't advertise. So your game is doomed. If you're a one product company, which most a lot of gaming companies are these days, if your game can't grow, if your game can't advertise, your company can't succeed. And that's why lifetime value at its core determines whether or not your business survives. That's why it is such an important KPI to understand, to measure, and then to work on and try to improve. It's also critical when you're actually not only have your game in the market, but you're at the early stages. I think all of us realize that there's millions of good ideas for games. Thinking about what you want to create with a new product is the easy part. I arguably see 5 or 10 game concepts a week, and they're all interesting. What's important is your greenlight process. How you're going to decide which games to actually spend your limited resources on building. That's where lifetime value comes in, because each game has a different potential lifetime value. So what you want to do is you want to look at these opportunities before you actually put resources into a game, before you start developing it, before you hire some artists, even before you do market research, and understand how the lifetime value for that game is going to differ from the other 5 or 10 opportunities you're looking at. And then on the counter side, look at, is advertising cost different? And what you want to do is you want to put your resources behind the products where that differential is the greatest, where your lifetime value it has a biggest gap with your cost per install, because that's where you have the most profit potential. Then once you launch the game, you want to deconstruct it, and you're not going to know immediately if it's a success, but by understanding lifetime value, you're going to be able to see if you're trending in the right way, that this product requires additional investment, or if, to be blunt, you should cut your losses and move on to another product. Again, lifetime value is at the core of whether or not what products you decide to build, and whether or not you continue to invest in the product that you've launched, or you move on. And then finally, once you've launched your game, even if it's successful, you want to have the biggest bang for your buck on additional investment into the game. With a social game, with a mobile game, creating the game is the easy part. The big revenue and the big expense is your ongoing, what's referred to as live services, your ongoing maintenance, your ongoing new content. And by understanding lifetime value, you know where to focus that. What areas of the game will have your biggest impact on lifetime value and then bring you your highest profitability. So hopefully now you agree with me that lifetime value, it's core to the survival of your game, potentially core to the survival of your company. But why the heck listen to me about it? There's a lot of people who know about lifetime value. What are you going to get out of spending the next 45 minutes with me? So I think what I bring to the table, and that's somewhat unique and a perspective that hopefully will help you, is, I've been in the game industry since 1993. As Jay mentioned, he and I worked together when he was first starting his career. And I've had the fortune of working for both really small startups, 2-people companies, and then some of the biggest companies in the world, like Zynga, Disney, Poker Stars, where I've done everything from launch games on a very, 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 very tight shoestring to being a general manager on games that have generated over $2 million a day in revenue. So I've been able to see how changes in lifetime value can impact products at all different scale and different stages of companies. Also, many of you are probably in the game industry just because your passion is gaming and you want to create fun games. Many of you are also in the industry because you want to sell your company or you want to make a lot of money. I've been lucky enough to be on the leadership team in 3 exits worth over $800 million in the past few years. And most of those exits have been driven by the core underlying lifetime value of our game or games. So again, understanding lifetime value, doing it right, setting it up right, can generate a lot of revenue for you as a game, as an owner or an indie game publisher. So it's really important to understand it, whether or not you just want to survive or whether or not you want to sell your company for hundreds of millions of dollars. And then I'll end it with, I've literally written the book on LTV. The only book that I know of in the game industry, and actually one of the very few on Amazon that's focused on the market. So at a minimum, by spending the next 45 minutes in the presentation, you save the $10 you would have to pay for the book on Amazon, because there's nothing in the book that we're not going to cover in the next few minutes. So hopefully that's giving you reason to understand why it's worthwhile to gain a deeper understanding of lifetime value. So as I mentioned, what is lifetime value? It's how much your customer is worth to you. Well, again, over their lifetime, but I'll put lifetime in quotes because for different companies, it means different things. Some companies, the lifetime of a player is only 3 months, and they look at it that way, and they base all their financial decisions. Others, it's 5 years. You can determine what the time horizon is. Actually, what we're going to talk about is there's no one lifetime value function or formula. It's going to be different for every product in every game. And part of it is when you're determining it, you're determining how you define lifetime. And at its core, and this is where we're really going to spend the bulk of our time, lifetime value is determined by 3 buckets. One is retention and engagement, which I'll use relatively interchangeably. It means how long a person is going to stay with your product. When are they, how many days, months, years are they going to play it, and how often they're going to play it each day or each month. The second one is monetization. When they do spend money, how much money they're going to spend. And finally, and this one we'll go into a little bit more subtleties there, is not used by all companies, but it's virality. How many new users one existing user will bring in. But yeah, at its basic part, if you deconstruct the lifetime value, it's a combination of retention, monetization, and virality KPIs. So as I said, what drives it is virality. Virality, the one that's probably the least discussed, is, for every user you bring in, how many new users do they bring in? Very big determinant of lifetime value, because you're paying to acquire 1 user. If they bring in 10 users, effectively buy 1, get 10 free. Retention, as I mentioned in the restaurant example, is critical for making sure that your players keep coming back. And that's what we'll discuss in a second, really drives your lifetime value. And monetization. If they don't spend money in your product, your lifetime value is 0. So you can't, so lifetime value is a function. If you don't, retention and monetization are intermixed. So you have to be healthy in both of those. Virality is something that you can say goes on top, but it could be to the degree that it goes on top, but is your key driver of LTV. And one of the cores, before we actually get into what makes up LTV, is LTV is not a function, it's not a formula where you plug in numbers and you get an absolute value. Because what you're doing is you're creating a prediction in the future. Think of LTV, lifetime value, as the weather. If you're trying to figure out what the temperature in New York is going to be in a week, you might be the best weather forecaster in the world, but you're not going to be able to make a perfect prediction every time of the weather in New York City in 10 days, because it's a prediction. It's not a value just driven by previous results. So what you're doing is you're creating a range, a forecast, effectively a best guess. And rather than a point value, what lifetime value is a guess, but it's a range. So you can be comfortable that it's going to be, plus or minus, and it's going to be different for every product, say 5 or 10% from that prediction. And why you can't get a perfect prediction, not only in lifetime value, but in weather or anything, it's the uncertainty principle. You would have thought Stephen Hawking was a game developer. But as he pointed out, perfect predictions are impossible in the universe because there is uncertainty. There's too many variables that we can't take into account that determine what's going to happen in the future. So instead, you have a range of likely outcomes, and your lifetime value prediction is the most likely. Anyone being in the game industry a while knows that chaos and game industry are almost synonymous. So I love this bullet point. But what it really means here is that there's small things that can happen that are not at all part of your lifetime value equation that really can have a big impact on the product. And there's no way you can know about them. If you look at chaos theory, which was popularized and a big part of mathematics in the late 20th century. One of the kind of classic examples, and I'm butchering it a little, is, a bird is hit by a car in a street in Beijing, and it leads to a series of cascading effects that causes a hurricane in the Caribbean. And those are true, there's true examples, not the one I gave, because again, I probably mixed metaphors there. But that's how chaos theory unfolds. And you see it even in lifetime value. Someone catches a virus in Wuhan in February, and all the brilliant lifetime value calculations that people at Supercell did for Clash back in December are, thrown out the window because that virus cascades into a worldwide pandemic, which drives people to stay at home and play more Clash of Clans. So you do see that your predictions aren't going to be perfect, which also means that when you're basing decisions, especially monetary decisions, understand it's a prediction with a range of errors. That said, what I've experienced working with some really great data analysts and data scientists is that you can get your lifetime value predictions where they're generally in that 90–95% accurate range, which is a heck of a lot better than most weather forecasters. But again, keep in mind, lifetime value is a prediction, it's a forecast, it's not an absolute point value, which means also if you miss it by 5 cents, when you go back and you look 6 months, don't fire your analysts. They probably did an incredible job. So going to the core of calculating lifetime value. You start, and the most important one is retention. Again, I say most important one, and I'm not saying it flippantly. It's not some prejudice on my side that, I grew up living with retention fans or something. It's the one that really drives your lifetime value. And I'll keep going back to a restaurant example because I love restaurants. And but it's really something that everyone can understand. So, think of 2 different scenarios. One is you have a restaurant down on Broadway in New York, and you just opened it up. You serve excellent food. Someone comes in, they have a great meal for $20. They come back every month for the rest of the year, spending $20 each time. You've done a good job. Another scenario, and because you focus on retention, so you have a lifetime value in that case, $240, 12 times 20. Another scenario, restaurant, you serve the exact same meal, charge $20, but then you add to the tip, to the bill, a $3 surcharge for entertainment because you turn Spotify on, another $2 charge for bread. So you got $25 from your customer. So that transaction was $25. You were able to increase monetization by $5 or 25% over what the first scenario was. But the player never comes back. Your customer never comes back. So that lifetime value is $25. So what you see is by focusing on retention and getting the customer to come back, your lifetime value is $240 instead of $25. And that's the real impact of retention on the lifetime value. It has a multiplicative impact that you can't get from just increasing monetization. And it's why it's at the core of lifetime value. And because lifetime value is at the core of survival of your company, it puts retention at the center to whether or not you succeed. Without a product and without a game that retains well, you're going to fail. And if you want a long-term increase in your lifetime value, you focus on retention. What we're going to be talking about with retention in the other areas is, every company, every product is different, and there's different KPIs that you can use in building out your lifetime value model. And with retention, it comes down to preferences, but it also comes down to the type of product it is, the type of users you're getting. And I'm going to go over the kind of key ones. And what I would recommend you do is you create almost a cocktail of retention and monetization KPIs when you build your lifetime value model. So the one that is my personal favorite, and I find the most effective KPIs to use when we're looking at retention, is KUR, NUR, and RUR. So what they are, not me trying to sound like an animal, but it's current user return rate, new user return rate, and reactivated user return rate. And we're going to go into more detail on all of these in a minute. But what they are, in effect, is what percent of your players, your existing KUR would be your current users, what percent of your current users who are already stable, happy users in your game are still coming back? And why it's important is you're not just looking at new users, you're looking at the core of your product and you're understanding whether or not they are engaged enough to stay in the product, whether or not, if you're a television show, after they've watched 2 episodes, are they still watching the 3rd and 4th episode, or have they already moved over to Netflix? After that on here is what's called the DX retention metric, be day 1, day 3, day 7. That's probably the one that's most common in the gaming industry. Nothing wrong with it. In a nutshell, what it is day 1, D1 would be how many players who registered for your game, which is just installed the app. That would be considered day 0, returned on day 1. Day 7 is how many who installed the app on day 0, returned specifically on the 7th day, not the 8th or 9th, but we're there on the 7th, et cetera, et cetera. Again, this is common. It's easy to calculate. You just track the user from the time they install to your day 1, your day 3, your day 7, et cetera. Why I prefer the KER, NER, RER metrics is that these are all focused on comparing to the day of install. So it's very biased. Even if you're looking at day 90 or day 180, it's still really biased in the early stages of your funnel and how people initially enjoy the product, rather than have you created a great experience that people keep coming back to. The third line there is one that I actually find really interesting. It's one I borrowed from the land-based world. My focus these days is on social casino. And what you see at land-based casinos is they judge their retention by how many days per month a customer comes in. So, they're doing great if they're getting someone in, say, 13 days a month. And maybe they're really struggling if it's 0.5 days a month. It's the same in your app. You can look at how many days a person is playing or how many times per day. And it's really insightful to see how engaged they are with the product. Churn rate is almost the opposite of KER. It's how many of your users, it could be your new users, it could be your existing users, leave the product each day, each month, each year. Going into my favorite metrics, KER, NER, and RER, here is some more details. I'm going to be putting it on SlideShare later, and I think Jay and Indy are also going to be posting it. So I'm not going to go into too much detail or any of the boring maths here. But again, KER is, and I really want to stress it because it's probably the most underused KPI in the industry and arguably one of the most effective. But what it says is how many of your current players you're able to retain week on week. And in a nutshell, it's calculated by looking at people who played your game between 2 and 3 weeks ago, came back and played between 1 and 2 weeks ago. So that defines them as a current user. They played, they played at least once 2 weeks in a row. How many of those people came back last week? Again, don't worry about memorizing it, but effectively you're establishing that they're a returning user. They played a couple weeks in a row, and then you want to see if they did come back next week. Normally a good number or an average number for that is about 80% of your recurring users, your current users, are going to come back every week. If you're significantly above it, you have a great product that people love. If you're significantly below it, that's where you need to focus, and you're probably screwed. Next area is monetization. So I love retention. I always try to focus on it, but monetization is also important. If people, you can have a great product. If you don't charge anyone anything for it, your lifetime value is still going to be 0. And monetization is also arguably the easiest of the 3 buckets to influence. So you can't, there are lots of techniques to improve monetization. We'll go over a few of them, but you could pretty much walk down any street in San Francisco and find 10 product managers who are experts on monetization who could help improve it. But when you're calculating your lifetime value, again, you want to get a cocktail or a smorgasbord of different KPIs to look at the patient. These are among the most common, but there's probably about 20 or 30 that people use. I'll call out a few of them. ARPDAU is, just like day 1, day 3, day 7. That's probably the one you look at the most in the social gaming space. It's average revenue per daily active users. So if you have 1,000 users and you generate $100 a day, it means your ARPDAU is 10 cents. It's a good way. You like to look at it on a daily basis because it takes away some of the fluctuations that you get from big spenders. And again, this is really probably the most common used one in the mobile social gaming space. When you're looking and calculating lifetime value, though, there's 3 that really jump out in giving you a very accurate picture of your player. So first is recency. How recently has someone made a purchase if you want to calculate their future value, the present value, the lifetime value to them in the future? What's interesting is that most studies have shown the person who, say, spent $5 with you yesterday is going to be worth much more than a person who spent $30 with you, say, 2 weeks ago. Recency is a really good indicator of the future value of a customer. Another one that's very important is frequency of purchases. Someone who's made 8 purchases is more at $10 each is probably more likely to have a high lifetime value than someone who's made 2 $50 purchases. And then, not contradictory to frequency, but one that's actually often neglected when you look at lifetime value, but is a big driver, is something called clumpiness. So people who make a batch of purchases, then might wait a little bit of time, make another batch of purchases, are usually more valuable than someone who evenly spreads out their purchases. I don't know exactly the psychology. You can hypothesize what drives it. But the fact is that you're looking for clumpiness. You're looking for people who are going to make a batch of purchases at the same time. There's a lot of other KPIs that you're going to include in your monetization cocktail. They're listed here. But those are the ones that are really the ones that are going to be probably at the core of determining most of your accuracy in your lifetime value. And then virality. So as opposed to monetization and retention, which if they approach 0, means your lifetime value becomes 0. Virality is one that actually a lot of companies assume is 0, and they do not even include in their lifetime value calculation. Back in the good old days, when Playfish and Playdom and Zynga first got into the social space, virality was actually the most important driver of lifetime value. It was because, if you remember well, you couldn't go on Facebook without seeing 20 mentions on your feed about how your cow is dying or how your friend invites you into his mob and mafia wars or whatever. And those drove Zynga to a valuation of something like $15 or $17 billion. I remember when it went public, it was about the same size as Facebook, believe it or not. And that was because of K factor, because they only had to pay to acquire 1 or 2. For every user they acquired, they would put up these Facebook feeds, which would bring in 5, 10, 100 users. Again, just like coronavirus, once you get over the R factor, what they call it in the virus scene, as any of us who listen to Dr. Forkey know, once you get over 1, it means the virus keeps growing out of control. It's the same with a game, but a lot better when it happens in your game. The good news about virality is much easier to calculate, or it's much more straightforward than retention or monetization, where you have a lot of options. K factor is driven by 2 things: number of invites sent by a player, and then for the people who receive those invites, the number of them who've actually installed your game app. And by sending invites, I don't mean actually sending a letter. It could be anything from a text message to email to me walking down to the casino saying, hey, have you guys played Slotomania? Those are all considered invites. Again, the conversion percentage is how many will end up moving over to the product. So this was how do you calculate LTV? You're probably expecting to write down, okay, this is actually how I figure it out. Unfortunately, I don't have that number. No one has that number. It's different for every game. You can find some great tools on the web. I've actually even blogged about it once or twice. But effectively, it's going to be different for every product. You need to kind of look at the data, get your data scientists to do it, look at historicals, but understand what it is it's going to be a function of retention KPIs, monetization KPIs, and possibly virality KPIs. And that's how you calculate it. Okay, so you now understand what makes up lifetime value. What do you actually do to improve it? Let's say you have a game, your lifetime value is $1, and your cost per install is $1.10. You can just give up, or you can find a stupid investor who will give you money to pay for advertising, even though that you're paying $1.10 to buy $1. Or you can actually look at improving it. By understanding what makes up lifetime value, it gives you a much better understanding of how you can move from now $1 LTV to $1.30 or $1.50 or even $2. And those type of jumps are not at all impossible. You see them all the time, even with established games. But it's, and it comes down to your specific game. You're going to have different opportunities, different areas that are weak. But I always say start with retention. That's why it's all capitalized. Retention is incredibly powerful. Again, that restaurant scenario, if you can go from in person to visit your restaurant twice in a year to visiting 10 times in a year, it's going to increase your LTV 5 times. Monetization, it's much harder to get a 5x increase. So you can increase the size of the bill 5 or 10%, but that's all it's going to do. You're not going to have that order of magnitude change that retention has. Virality, as I said, that's great. That could actually have a bigger impact than an improvement in retention, but it's so hard to achieve these days because there's so few tools out there that you have to have the right product and you have to have the right idea. If I knew how to promise you great virality, I wouldn't be here. I'd be counting all my money. Retention there's lots of techniques that you can do to improve retention. If you have an awful product, you're not going to retain people. But there are things you can do with a good product to help retain it better. And as I said, monetization, probably the easiest of the KPIs to impact. So we're starting with retention. Just like retention is important, the most important thing to keep your players retained, engaged, is content. So you've probably heard people speaking, often disparagingly, about how a lot of games are a content treadmill. All they're doing is putting out new content. Well, that's true, but rather than looking at it disparagingly, look at it as an opportunity and part of your plan. We are in the entertainment business when you create games. We're similar to a Netflix, we're similar to a television studio, a movie studio. We're producing entertainment. And what is entertainment? It's a consumable content. When I watch a movie, I might watch it 2 or 3 times, or again, going back to the Star Wars example, I might watch it 10 or 20 times, but I'm not but at some point you want fresh, you want new. And time again, that's what drives the engagement, the retention of your game. So rather than trying to play tricks or convince yourself that you're going to do all these great features, first and foremost, look at quality and quantity of content. And you can't neglect either of them. So quality is important. If you put out garbage, no one's going to want to come back. Look at the season or the second group of 3 Star Wars movies. Didn't exactly do much for getting retention into the franchise. And the same here. You put out garbage sequels, garbage content, filler content. People are going to not be interested and they're going to leave. Conversely, you put out a great piece of content. If you don't get another piece of content out for a year, they're going to run out of things to do. They're going to leave the game. And the chances of getting them re-engaged in a year, really, really small. You have to do everything you can to just create a constant stream of good content. I think I've stressed it as much as I can, but I will say it again. This is really going to be your key to keeping players engaged. Getting them to play more, getting them not to leave your game, is continuously giving them. You have to have a good underlying game. That's not what we're talking about here, but you always have to be adding new content. And you'll be amazed at how quickly they consume it. And if you think you have enough content for a month, double it or triple it. And you're still going to have your top players use it up. The second part of getting your players and keeping your players retained and engaged is getting inside their heads. In my first company, a company called Merscom, on our board of advisors was a gentleman named Dan Ariely. Some of you might have heard of him since. He's gone on to write books like Predictably Irrational. He's arguably kind of the most sought after behavioral economist in the world. We were lucky as a startup to have him when he had just finished his PhD work. He didn't know much about the game industry, but he gave me a piece of advice that I've never forgotten and I've always tried to use. Successful products, and this isn't necessarily games, are products that people are thinking about when they're not using them. So Tesla is a great success story because people who are not necessarily driving their Teslas are still thinking about it, still getting excited about it. Star Wars, again, going back to that, is a great entertainment franchise because even when you're not watching a Star Wars movie, you're using it as an analogy during a presentation, or you're thinking about how you would be a Jedi, or you're thinking about what the next movie is going to have. You're thinking about these great products, great franchises when you're not using it. It needs to be the same with your games. Again, going back to the Zynga example and the heyday of social games, I remember people getting up in the middle of the night to feed their fish in Fishville or clean their restaurant in Restaurant Empire. That's what, those games were really in their players' heads. Even when they weren't playing about it, they were thinking about it. And that's when you know you have a successful product, and that's how you improve LTV, because that's how you get them re-engaged. That's how you keep them from leaving your product. So content, number one, getting inside your players' heads. There are ways, there are techniques that you do keep your players more engaged. Product features. If you look at retention, and this is why the day 1, day 7, day X metrics are so popular, is that it is based on that early user experience is a disproportionate impact. So getting your first time user experience down. So you want to get your people hooked. You don't want to give them a reason to leave early. So getting the FTUI right. Putting in progression mechanics is really critical to retaining players, because as you level up, you're less likely to leave because you don't want to lose the progress that you made. Collection mechanics, well proven in social games. You're all game people. I don't have to go into detail. Social features. I've seen a lot of, for lack of a better word, really mediocre products that have done well because they include these social features that almost make the products, rather than being a social casino or an RPG, they're almost a platform for you to communicate with your friends. And I would actually say that ties into content, because that communication becomes user-generated content. It's always fresh, there's always something new, and it's always relevant to your players because they're creating it. So don't underestimate the power of social features to keep people engaged and retained. Marketing, that's not just for acquiring players. It's actually a very strong tool for getting them to stay engaged, to get inside their heads when they're not in the product. It could be anything from CRM, which is customer relationship management, things like push notifications, email, other types of messaging, to paid advertisements to bring people back. And then events, which I'll talk about in a minute. But that's actually one of the biggest drivers of retention these days. It's anything from a happy hour for a couple hours in a game that creates excitement, it creates new content, to a 3-day challenge where you need to amass the most points possible to climb Mount Everest in your match 3 game. And then the final one I want to touch on when talking about retention is support. So people do not stay loyal to a product because they get a great support experience. As much as you want to have this wow story, like a Zappos of someone who spent 10 hours on the phone with a CS agent, it's been proven that there's actually like no correlation between great customer support and retention. Where there is a huge correlation is between bad customer experiences and churn. And if you think about it yourself, think about the retailers you used to love, or the online retailers you went to, or the restaurants you used to go to, and why you stopped going. It's probably because you had one really bad experience. I know I can think of more bad experiences than more wow experiences and how that impacted me. So what you want to do is you want to avoid giving people that reason to leave your product. And that's what your support needs to do. It needs to make it effortless so that not even noticed and people just want to stay in. I talked about events, but when you're looking at retention, and I talked about live services at the beginning, really about focusing on the live services, the holistic experience of the product. And this is why, once you've launched your game, this needs to be your focus. And first, a quick definition of live services. So the textbook definition is the changes, content, events in the product that do not require development. So as opposed to a feature like a loyalty system, which requires developers and programmers and product managers. This is something that's created outside the development team and doesn't require development resources. I say textbook because a lot of games, even to do things that should not require development resources, do. But it's a kind of subjective distinction, but I think it kind of shows the type of things that we're talking about with live services and how these can be used to really improve the retention engagement of your players. I'll touch on a few here. Most of them are self-explanatory, but events. Again, this is what's being proven day in, day out for the last few years that have really driven mobile gaming. Creating this one-day special event where everyone gets together and tries to, get 1 million spins on a slot machine or move up the most levels, whatever you can call it, the Mount Everest Challenge, however you want to do it, or a 2-hour happy hour every week. These type of events create excitement. They cause the product to feel like it's alive, feel like it's changing as opposed to being static, which is really what customers today want. They want something that's new. They want something that is tied to each day and personalized. And that's what you can do with events. The other thing that doesn't get enough attention is your economy optimization. And I'll go back to the first time I launched a slot game. We launched it. It was a beautiful game. We had done a really good job, but the KPIs were okay. It was, our LTV was higher than our CPI. So we were not in survival mode, but we were not doing nearly as well as some of the other social casinos. And I remember our director of product, rather than focusing on the big features that some of the people on the team wanted to do, things like tournaments and, a new daily bonus and everything, it's kind of what I would call the sexy, bold beat features that look good in a PowerPoint presentation. What he did was effectively had the product team stop development on features for a month and focus on balancing and optimizing the economy. So again, this is a slots game. So it's everything from the RTP, that's how much the house keeps from every spin on a slot, to the how many chips you got when you made a purchase, how many chips you get when you get a daily bonus, how many chips are the minimum bet, your maximum bet. And what he, the analysis started to show is that in our effort when we launched the game to optimize monetization, we had what was referred to as a very tight product. People would run out of chips quickly. I think at the time, we thought that was the best way to generate a high ARPDAU and thus a high LTV. What he saw was, in the analysis, he also compared it to other products at the time, games like Slotomania, Heart of Vegas, Double Down were leading the industry. They were much looser, but making much more money. So we evolved our economy, and we actually did it in a big bang. We changed everything at once so that we were much more generous. And what we found was it moved us from being what I'd refer to as an also-ran to being one of the top 5, maybe at the time, one of the top 3 social casinos, just by changing the economy, just by getting it into balance where people were getting the right value. And it did impact monetization. We'll talk about that in a second, but it really impacted retention. It really got people coming back more, playing more, and that's how it set this product up so it became one of the most, as I said, successful social casinos. Events, economy optimization. One that I think's been neglected is subscriptions. That is a revenue driver also, but the real value of subscriptions is that with a monthly or a weekly or even a fortnightly recurring subscription, it's a prompt. It drives people to stay in the product. It helps your retention. It helps your engagement KPIs. Again, everything here, pretty self-explanatory. Jumping over to virality. If you get it right, it's huge. If you get it right, you're creating the coronavirus of games, which is actually a good thing, in that you're spreading it really quickly. You don't have to spend as much on marketing, and your LTV will skyrocket it because for every player you acquire, they are driving new installs, which adds to the initial player's lifetime value. Again, easy to understand virality. It really just has 2 components. how many people each one of your players will encourage or somehow try to get into the game, and how many of those people will actually install the game. Succeeding is a lot more difficult. Ever since Facebook changed rules on their feed, either for privacy or to prevent spam, or some people think to drive advertising, generally it's become a lot harder. Just because something's harder, though, doesn't mean it's impossible, which is why I have this slide here, which is why I encourage everyone to explore virality. You have to look at ways to reduce friction. And it might be, ways that people can verbally entice their friends in. It might be group activities that encourage them to invite friends to a poker game or something. You also want to make it prestigious for them to invite it. You don't want to be the Tupperware person you're trying to get people to buy something they don't want. You want to make it so that when they go to their friends and try to encourage them to play your RPG or something, they can brag about it. They can say how cool it is, and it's a prestigious event. You want it to be emotional. That's why people do things. You want a product that actually connects with people. It's why having a list of features on a spreadsheet doesn't create a great product. You need something that connects with people, and that will encourage them to get their friends to play. And allow them to tell stories about it. Stories are the most powerful mechanic we have for spreading information in the world. It's why politicians use it. It's why you see it in marketing. It's why you see it in the news. People care about stories a lot more. So make your product, make inviting friends storyable. Make it break up into stories. And then on the other side, make it appealing for people to convert. Give them an offer they can't refuse. Give them special value. Give them a reason to convert. Not saying this is easy. I've tried and failed multiple times on virality, but this is a way that not everyone else is trying to improve their LTV that can have a great impact. And then finally, monetization. And you'll see here, actually, some of the things that are going to improve your monetization also will improve your retention and engagement. I said it before, I think I stressed it enough, but content is huge. Content not only drives people coming back to the game, playing more, it drives monetization. On that slot that I talked about that I launched about 5 or 6 years ago that really skyrocketed, what we saw was every time we launched new content, revenue would go up 20 or 30%. It would last for 2 or 3 days. The best way, the easiest way, just like it is the best, easiest way to sustain retention, to sustain monetization, is new content. And what's nice about it, it's not cannibalistic. You're not moving purchases from one day to another. You're actually creating more revenue. Balancing that example I used before by giving people the right value. And it's not necessarily giving them more. So in that example, it was giving them more, but you have to find that right balance. Hence the word balancing, between giving them more, but also giving them a reason to purchase. Events not only generate excitement and engagement, they're also, if structured well, can be a good monetization tool. Skipping ahead, the other one I really want to highlight, because we are running out of time and I don't want Dan to have to interrupt me, is the shopping experience. So when you're creating your virtual store inside your game and when you're packaging your products, think like a retailer. When I worked at Playdom, which at the time was one of the biggest social game companies, along with Zynga and Playfish, we had someone on the monetization team whose only previous experience was at Abercrombie in retail, where he would effectively be a buyer and set up the store displays. And I always thought that was a brilliant hire. Because companies like Walmart and Target, what they do really well is manage the shopping experience. So people both enjoy it, but they're driven to get what would be referred to as share of wallet. So that effectively you spend more in Walmart than you did plan on going in, and you spend more in Walmart than you do at the 2 or 3 other shops you stop on the same trip. And they do it by really understanding the experience. And that's where, again, behavioral economics comes into play. One of the most important things to do is avoid choice overload, or cognitive overload, a more technical phrase for it. Really interesting study was done a few years ago, where it was an A/B test where people in a supermarket were shown 2 different options. One group of shoppers in the supermarket had their choice of 5 jams and jellies. The other group, 50 jams or jellies. The first group, the one who only saw 5, purchase significantly more jam and jelly than the second group. And what that says was that people don't want unlimited choices. Those 5 choices that were in the first group were also in the 50 plus products that the other group saw, but they still spent less, even though they could have bought it, which means you don't want, and I think the tendency in the game space is throw everything at your players. Give them a ton of options, give them a ton of virtual goods, they're going to spend more. That's not the case. You need to manage that experience, because what you get is overload, where people see so many choices, they just say, forget it, I'm not buying anything. And they might not say that consciously, but they say, okay, I'm going to come back. There's too many things to consider. Really, the amount's going to be different. I've heard that 7 is the ideal number. I think it's going to be different by product, where they are in the stage of the game, and there's different things you need to test. But that's one of the takeaways from here, that if you want to increase your LTV, back it all the way down into monetization and avoiding choice load. A couple of really effective other techniques from behavioral economics is anchoring. Let's say you have, again, multiple price points, and you'd like more players to spend $50 on virtual currency. Rather than making that the top price point, put in a $1,000 price point. Or if you're in Apple, you don't have that option, but put in the maximum price point, not to drive people to that price point, but it makes the $50 one look a lot less if they also see a $1,000 price point. Decoy effect is similar. Going back to the restaurant analogy, let's move over to a McDonald's. You might have a burger that sells for $1, Big Mac that sells for $2.50. Rather than trying to get people to decide between the $1 burger and the $2.50 burger, you create a Happy Meal where you get a burger, a quarter pounder for $2.50. A quarter pounder plus fries plus a drink for $3. What you end up happening by giving people those 3 options, rather than comparing the extra value meal with the $1 burger and deciding if they want that, they compare it with the $2.50 quarter pounder only. It's like, well, $2.50, $3 bargain, the full meal. So what you're doing is you're driving them to the quarter pounder away from the burger, which was your original goal, by not expecting them to spend $2.50 just on the quarter pounder, but using that as a decoy that drives them to the meal. Again, these are different techniques. I'm a huge fan of behavioral economics. There's a lot you can do with it to really understand your customer's behavior. With that, I will see, I know we're running low on time, but see if there's any questions or comments. If there aren't, I'd love it if you guys check out my blog occasionally. I do write about lifetime value a lot. Also happy if you connect with me on LinkedIn. Obviously, the name is Lloyd Melnick. If you do want to connect on LinkedIn, all I ask is that you please include a short message, either that you saw me at this conference or just why you want to connect, because the negative on LinkedIn is all the spam you get. So I try not to connect with anyone who doesn't include a message. But thank you for your time. I hope you found it useful. And if we have time for questions, I'm open for any.
All right, let me pop some questions in here. We do got a couple minutes, but we have 2 questions. The first one is from Christopher. How does effective community management assist in LTV? Also, what are your indicators that are actually increasing your lifts, not just artificially inflating them?
Okay, so I'll start with the first question because that's the easiest, and I'm actually a big fan of community, and everywhere I've been, I've put a lot of resources into it. It actually serves 2 purposes, and it's almost always on the retention side. So I talked about having your players think about the game when they're not in it. That's a great way to do it. Either if it's a Facebook community, they're thinking about it on Facebook, or even if it's a distinct community that they're going to. And what that does is it means that they're able to talk about it. It provides a trigger to go back into the game. It's also a great reactivation tool because, okay, I might have gotten tired of the game, but I'm not tired of the community. I keep going back to the community, and eventually it whets my appetite to go back to the product. So what you see is that it does actually drive a lot of retention KPIs, both in preventing churn, but getting more engagement out of already existing users. Dan, can you repeat the second part of that question, please?
Sure. The second part is, what are your indicators that are actually increasing your lifts, not just artificially inflating them?
Well, I think when you calculate your LTV, if you're doing it right, it's all the ones I mentioned might be. I think if you're artificially creating them, as soon as you start testing your LTV model, what you're going to find is it diverges from reality. If you're putting in what I call vanity metrics, and some of my favorite are like monthly unique users, or things that aren't really driving value, it's not going to touch your LTV, and that's why lifetime value is so important. When you're actually calculating it, and one thing I didn't talk about is after you've done this, it's not fire and forget. You need to regularly go back and see how accurate your model was. And if you have these vanity metrics in there, which a lot of companies throw out there, especially bigger companies, because it helps internally, it helps people get promoted. It's something to show at your PowerPoints during lunch. But those vanity metrics won't impact your lifetime value. And that's actually why I think lifetime value is so important. So I'm kind of taking the opposite approach. Rather than looking at what KPIs first, which retention metrics or which monetization metrics, you want to start with your lifetime value calculation and then back out of that which metrics you're looking at, because you should only be looking at metrics that are impacting your lifetime value. If the metric doesn't impact lifetime value, it's not important. So going back to the first question, like with social media, I don't look at likes. I don't look at shares, because to me, those are vanity metrics. I look, when we're assessing it, to what they're driving inside the game. And I actually look at how it impacts my CUR and my RUR, because again, those are my pet metrics that I love and I try to use everywhere I am. Hope that answers the question. Feel free to follow up on LinkedIn or however or on Discord afterwards.
Okay, we've got one more. If you can answer it in like a minute, we'll see what happens. We'll see what happens.
I take the challenge.
Here we go. Let's see. Wrong one. Hi, Lloyd. Thank you for such an insightful presentation. My question is, what would you suggest as the first steps to unknown game developers to start marketing games and getting players?
I think you need to pick a territory, a cheap territory, but one more obviously English is spoken and you can monetize a little. I actually always jump for a country like India or Turkey. Obviously Turkey's not English first, and do Facebook ads. Make sure you manage your bids. You're going to have to spend a little, but then you're going to start getting some real data. And the reason I say a country, rather than going to the United States or Canada, where you're only able to get a few players, at least here you can get a decent number of players. So you start seeing if you're retaining them. And then when you're marketing them, I wouldn't get too worried about how much money you're making. I'd really focus on those retention KPIs initially. If they're good, it means you can go out to your friends and family and raise more money and figure out how to monetize them. But really, market it in kind of second or third tier countries with a limited budget, and see if you're able to retain your players.
That's good stuff. I know there's some other questions, and once again, if you want to reach out to Lloyd, he is on LinkedIn and also at lloydmelnick.com. Thanks so much, Lloyd, for joining us. Our next session is how indie developers can polish their branding with Rachel Presser, the Toad Lady herself. Thank you, guys.